Hi, and welcome to Truth to Power. I'm William Roberts. I'm here with Adam Weinstein. Adam is the Deputy Director of the Middle East Program at the Quincy Institute. His current research focuses on security and rule of law in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iraq. Adam's analysis has been featured in the Washington Post, the UK Guardian, Foreign Policy Magazine, War on the Rocks, Lawfare, and The National Interest. Before coming to Quincy, Adam worked for a Big Five accounting firm in the international trade practice and assisted multinational clients in navigating Asia's trade landscape, incorporating human rights, due diligence into supply chains, managing sanctions risk, and utilizing free trade agreements. He also worked as a senior law and policy analyst at the National Iranian American Council, where he focused on the securitization of U.S. immigration policy. Adam, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Adam also received his JD from Temple University Beasley School of Law in Philadelphia, where I spent many years as a reporter with a concentration in international law and transitional justice, and importantly served as a U.S. Marine in Afghanistan in 2012 as part of a detachment to the 2nd Air Naval Gunfire Liaison Company, where he served in Uruzgan province in support of Australia's 2nd Commando Regiment. Adam, thanks for joining us. Just quickly, before we jump into our topic today, which is the U.S., Iran, and the Middle East, tell us about the Quincy Institute, if you would. What is the Quincy Institute, and what is it you guys do?
Well, the Quincy Institute is based in Washington, D.C., although we have some staff in other places. And we're a think tank. We sometimes call ourselves an action tank because we're proactive in promoting policies. But essentially, we're a think tank that's rooted in the theory of restraint, which is, the short of it is the idea that many of the United States' interests can be solved by diplomacy, not through wars of choice and military interventions, and that the pursuit of primacy by the United States shouldn't be the default, and that instead we should focus on cooperating with other countries, including adversaries.
So you guys are advocates for diplomacy first, and this is why I was excited to have you on, because the recent U.S. strategic bombing of Iran's nuclear facilities is a major shift in U.S. posture. It's had a dramatic effect, I think, still kind of unknown, unwinding, reverberating effect. So I'm curious what your assessment is of those strikes that President Trump ordered. What it means for the Middle East and the U.S. non-proliferation policy and the long and fraught efforts to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. But I'm curious. We saw Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu at the White House last week with President Trump. They talked about a possible ceasefire between Israel and Gaza that hasn't materialized yet. What do you expect to see out of that, and where do we think that conflict is headed?
Well, first on the strikes, I mean, the negotiations that Trump claims he had given the Iranians 60 days to achieve, I mean, that's not serious. Trump took 18 months to negotiate with the Taliban for a U.S. withdrawal that both of them wanted. Okay, the original JCPOA, or Iran nuclear deal, I believe, took 20 months. So 60 days is just not serious. So I'll start there. Going to the meeting.
JCPOA is Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action.
Yes, correct. We can just say the Iran nuclear deal for short.
Yeah, and that was negotiated by former Senator John Kerry on behalf of President Barack Obama.
Correct. And that took something like 20 months. Trump's deal with the Taliban, which was much simpler by comparison, took something like 18 months. So 60 days just isn't serious. We also have to remember that the Iranians waited, something like 4+ years after the agreement was abrogated and they still came back to talks. So 60 days is just not a serious number. I think what really happened is that Netanyahu saw that there was progress being made in the negotiations, so he decided that it was in Israel's interest to conduct strikes, both to eliminate the senior command of the IRGC, sabotage the talks, and hopefully pull the U.S. and convince the U.S. to conduct these kinds of strategic strikes against the nuclear facilities. Trump saw that the strikes were going well on a tactical level, and that much of the senior command of the IRGC was killed, and many nuclear scientists as well. And so he just couldn't help himself, and he joined the strikes, and he sabotaged his own diplomatic talks that were actually making progress. That's the short of what happened, I think. In terms of what happened at the meeting between Netanyahu and Trump after the fact, well, they congratulated each other on the strikes. So did Secretary Hegseth with Netanyahu, and they patted each other on the back. And then I'm not sure much more came out of it. Supposedly, there's this ceasefire deal, but Palestinians in Gaza are still being killed by the dozens. The only silver lining is that some UN aid was permitted to enter Gaza. So that's really all that came out of it, in my view. The other thing that came out of it is that Trump appears to be essentially extorting the Israelis and saying that if you pursue Netanyahu in court for and hold him accountable, Trump is going to halt weapons transfers to Israel. So that's a level of foreign interference or blatant foreign interference that I don't think we've seen in some time. So that's what came out of it.
Mm-hmm. Where does this leave the government in Tehran? I mean, they have been funding proxies in Yemen and Lebanon and elsewhere. Of course, and in Gaza, where there's this narrative that's emerged that Israel has defeated its enemies or set them back in each of these places, but there's as yet no resolution to the conflict in Gaza. So, what should we expect going forward from Tehran and its posture towards Israel?
Well, I think Israel has had incredible success against its enemies. I mean, it eliminated Hassan Nasrallah, it eliminated Sinwar, the leader of Hamas, Hassan Nasrallah being the leader of Hezbollah. It
Mm-hmm.
essentially decapitated the leadership of Hezbollah, the leadership of Hamas, the leadership of the IRGC, Iran's axis of resistance, which is this constellation of non-state and state actors that are at least supported by Iran. It includes the Houthis, it includes Hamas, it includes Hezbollah, it includes certain Iraqi militias and so forth. It's been decimated in many ways. There's a government now in Syria that's unfriendly to the Iranians. So in many ways, the Israelis have had success, but somewhat like a gambler whose hand is up at a blackjack table or a poker table, they don't know when to stop. And so I think what they've inadvertently done is actually given the government in Iran a certain level of confidence. And the reason I'll tell you why I say that, because it might be counterintuitive to people who don't watch Iran closely, but I think the Iranian government was feeling extremely vulnerable. And that's why they were willing to come to the table with the Trump administration, despite the fact that the Trump administration killed the former Quds Force commander Qasem Soleimani. So this is an
Mm-hmm.
incredible grievance to the Iranians and to the supreme leader himself. The supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, was very close with Soleimani. Uh, Despite that, they were willing to come to the table because I think they felt very weak and very cornered. What these Israeli and US strikes did, though, was they let the regime know that even when the regime is backed into a corner and at its weakest, the Iranian people won't necessarily rise up against it. I mean, if there was ever a time where you were going to see perhaps an organized resistance to the regime from within Iran, you would have thought it might be as these strikes were happening. Because The supreme leader was in hiding. Almost the entire IRGC senior command had been killed, and yet we didn't see that. We almost saw a rally around the flag effect, and that doesn't mean that Iranians support the regime. It means that they don't support foreign powers, in particular the Israelis and the United States, conducting strikes inside their country. And so, if you're the regime, you might think, okay, well, we're economically isolated. Our axis of resistance has crumbled. But look at what happened. The thing that we fear most, which is an internal uprising, that didn't happen even when we were at our weakest. So maybe our regime is stronger than we think it is. And I think in some sense, it's probably given the supreme leader and the regime renewed confidence. And it also revealed that there's no organized resistance inside or outside of Iran. I mean, there's a bunch of Iranians that would like to see a more democratic system, but that hasn't translated into an organized resistance. So I think that's in some ways breathed new life into the Iranian regime.
I mean, there was talk in Israel and a little bit here in Washington that this bombing campaign might be a regime change effort by the Israelis or the U.S. I mean, bombing other countries never leads to regime change. The only example of regime change I can think of in the Middle East through military action is what the U.S. did in Afghanistan and Iraq, and that's boots on the ground. We're not about to send boots on the ground to combat troops to Iran. I mean, that would be folly. Where where do we go now? So we're not going to have a different government in Tehran. Diplomacy really is the only viable path to getting another country to agree not to build nuclear weapons. Where 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 is that process now? Where do we go from here?
The process is stagnant right now. The Iranians have kicked out the observers from the International Atomic Energy Agency. They're not going to go back to the table easily, because if they do, it will, erode their own legitimacy. They can't. It will demonstrate weakness, and you know, by even the Israeli accounts, not all of the enriched uranium was destroyed. Now, the Israelis claimed that it's inaccessible, so that they can't access it, and that they have satellites and drones observing things, and that if they saw an attempt by the Iranians to access this enriched uranium, they'd conduct further strikes. But we don't know that for sure. Some of it might have been taken away. Some of it, there might be renewed attempts to reestablish the nuclear program. I mean, now, of course, if you're a younger Iranian, you might not want to become a nuclear physicist these days. But the fact is that they have an incentive now to put that program into overdrive and to put it underground, literally and figuratively. And we have no eyes on. I mean, what we had before was we had a verification process. It wasn't perfect, but it was pretty good. And now we have nothing. And if you were going to conduct these strikes, it should have been done in a coordinated way where the Israelis and the Americans were on the same page, and it happened out of the blue. Perhaps you could make a case for that. I still think it would be the wrong move, but the way they did it was a particularly sort of ridiculous way in which they're telegraphing that they're going to do it, and then they do it. And then the Trump administration refuses to accept even questions about whether the strikes were successful, because they know that they probably weren't completely successful. That's why they don't want to entertain those questions. In terms of diplomacy, I will say diplomacy's never dead. I mean, the Iranians are still backed into a corner. Their axis of resistance is still decimated. They're seeing the region move on without them. They have economic problems. There's still reasons for them to come back to the table, but getting them back to the table is going to involve more concessions. It's going to involve less trust. The time frame it's going to take to eke out an agreement is going to be longer. And I think something that Americans are not good at, this kind of strategic empathy that's required for good diplomacy. I mean, I remember a photo of Vladimir Putin where he's gifting the Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei an antique Quran from the Caucasus region of Russia. And you can see the supreme leader, is assigning value to that. And I think a lot of I think a lot of U.S. Diplomats or U.S. technocrats would be like, "Well, what's the value in that? That's just for a photo." Yes, exactly. It's just for a photo, but it's a respect that Putin is showing Khamenei. Now, I'm not holding Putin is not someone to emulate when it comes to diplomacy, but the point I'm trying to make is that Iran sees itself as a great civilization. Iran sees itself as a leader in the Muslim world. Putin, as an example, understands that. I think when the U.S. negotiates with Iran, we tend to project our own views of Iran onto it, and so we see them as a backwater. We see them as an economically isolated, sort of backwards country that's not important, and we're going to treat them like that when we negotiate with them. But the Iranians see themselves as the descendants of the Persian Empire, this great civilization. And in fact, you actually see in Iran, in Tehran right now, some of the regime propaganda that has followed these strikes is actually making reference to the Persian Empire rather than Islam, because they're trying to galvanize the sense of Persian nationalism to sort of lift the country's spirits up. And so you have to treat the Iranians with a certain level of respect if you want to get a good diplomatic outcome from them. They don't respond well to coercion. They don't respond well to being commanded what to do or being threatened, and they're willing to sustain an incredible amount of punishment.
Mm.
Um, I mean, look at the Iran-Iraq War. Look at they've basically taken a beating in terms of sanctions. For decades, they've been one of the most sanctioned countries in the world, and yet they it hasn't broken them. So they're willing to take a real beating, and they don't respond to coercion. They actually would respond to a respectful engagement, I think.
Mm. I'm interested in and this goes back to history a little bit, how the Iranians view the United States. I mean, the CIA, in conjunction with the British in 1953, overthrew the democratically elected Prime Minister Mossadegh and installed the Shah as a monarch who ruled as a dictator, a brutal dictator with U.S. backing, until the revolution in 1979. And then there was the embassy hostage crisis. President Jimmy Carter ordered a special operations mission to try to free those hostages. It failed before even getting to Tehran, and the hostages weren't released until Ronald Reagan became president, potentially under threat of war. Reagan was making a lot of strong statements about the Iranians had better release our people. And we've been in this kind of diplomatic deadlock with them uh, pretty much ever since. What's what does that history mean for the Iranian nation, the Iranian people?
Well, by the way, the Shah was a complex character. I do agree there were brutal elements to him. A book that your listeners could read is called The Fall of Heaven.
Thank
Andrew Scott Cooper is the author's name, The Fall of Heaven. I think it's a very nuanced history of the Shah that's both critical, but also, gives him credit where credit is due. And also gives his wife credit where credit is due, because his wife was quite a shrewd politician herself. That being said, I mean, the average Iranian does view the U.S. It's they both view in my experience with Iranians, whether they're pro-regime or anti-regime or monarchists or not, they view the U.S. with a mix of awe and resentment. They do resent the role that the U.S. played. They think that the U.S. Many of them think the U.S. undermined Iran's democratic moment. They shot down a new U.S. warship accidentally shot down an Iranian airliner. We don't hear about these things. I mean, can you
Mhm.
imagine if Iran shot down a U.S. airliner? I mean, we would hear about this for eternity. Americans are very, very quick to forget the things we do. I mean, we still talk about the Russians shooting down an airliner, but we did the same thing.
Mhm.
Um, and Iranians view it that way. At the risk of, you know, sounding Orientalist, but I do think it's true. Conspiracy theories run abound in Iran and among the diaspora, and a lot of times things are viewed in a very conspiratorial way. But the reality is that some of those conspiracies are true. I mean, the United States has meddled in Iran. The UK did meddle in Iran, and we can't escape that history. So the perception of the United States is that basically the United States has undermined Iran's progress, and so this is true even among people who dislike the regime.
Mm. So now we have the second Trump presidency. As we discussed, Trump withdrew the United States from the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, which was not just between the U.S. and Iran, but it also included the EU, the United Nations, China, Russia, Britain, and France. The you described kind of a ad lib process, I think, at the White House in deciding to engage these strikes. How do we understand Trump's decision making process and the people around him, and what is driving U.S. policy in the Middle East now?
Well, what decision making progress? I mean, that's the real question. I'm not sure there is a decision making progress process. Now, some people will say that, okay, well, Trump is purposely unpredictable and this is a tactic. And that would make sense if he had a clear end goal that he has clarity about, and he engages in this unpredictable behavior, to keep people on their toes, and but he knows what he wants in the end. I don't think that's the case. I'm not sure Trump knows what he wants. I think it's more of a schizophrenic policymaking process, and his NSC is not, organized, and it's, he likes to have different people in his cabinet who have very contradicting views, but he changes his position from one day to the next. I mean, you hear him right now, he's talking about, can Zelensky bomb Moscow? And then a month ago he was talking about making the peace deal of the century. So what he thinks from one day to another really does change. Now in the Middle East, I do think he has a genuine desire to be viewed as a deal maker and a peacemaker, and he thinks he's going to remake the Middle East. And in some cases, you see him making decisions that are congruent with that, such as lifting sanctions on the new, I'm going to call it a regime because it's not democratic, the new regime in Syria,
Mm-hmm.
trying to give them a chance, accepting, we refer to it as facts on the ground, accepting the reality that al-Shara is the new leader of Syria. So let's just see let's see what he does, instead of living in fantasy land where we're going to have this perfect democratic leader. So you see him doing that. But on the other hand, you see him, conducting strikes on Iran, basically not putting real pressure on Netanyahu to stop his war and ethnic cleansing and war crimes in Gaza, which is a festering wound, which is going to undermine everything else he wants to do in the Middle East. So again, it's just a bit schizophrenic. I think his intentions are positive in the sense that he does want to see deals made in the Middle East. I don't think he has this sort of neoconservative ambition to remake the Middle East by force. But the problem is he contradicts himself, and he engages in this impulsive kind of behavior that undermines what he actually wants to do. And of course, you guys cheerleaders like, Lindsey Graham and other types of people who are probably pushing him to do these things. But he's, ultimately he's the decision maker, and he lacks a certain kind of strategic patience that you need for diplomacy. Diplomacy is not fast. Diplomacy is slow. Diplomacy sequencing matters, messaging matters. If the president says something off the cuff while he's boarding Air Force One and it's completely off message to what his own diplomats are telling, an adversary at the negotiating table, that can erase 2 months of work in 5 seconds. And he's extremely unpredictable. And I suspect his own diplomats are frustrated with that. I don't know that, but I suspect they are.
How do the Arab nations view this? You have Jordan, which is, host to, I want to say, millions of Palestinians. Egypt, which is, neighboring Gaza. Saudi Arabia, where Trump went for his first foreign trip with a couple dozen U.S. Corporate executives in tow, and where he and his sons are developing business relationships in Dubai and Abu Dhabi and Qatar. What's the how do we how do we see the role of the Arab states in serving as brokers, mediators, partners uh, in resolving either the Gaza crisis or the tension with Iran?
Well, as an example, I think the Saudis and the Turks were instrumental in convincing Trump that he should lift sanctions on Syria and that he should accept the new government. So I think he does listen to them.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly the Gulf Arabs are happy with Trump in office, and I think Trump is very receptive to their version of diplomacy, and they know how they know how to put on a show for Trump, and they do it quite well. They I don't know how much of an interest they have in resolving the Gaza crisis. I mean, they prefer for it to go away, but they have bigger things. They want, the Saudis want a deal with the U.S. They want investment. That's where their priorities lie. The Gaza crisis is an annoyance for them. They would prefer to resolve it, but I don't know that they're going to. I don't know that they're really going to exert like significant political capital or expend significant political capital to resolve it. But it is an issue. The Jordanians, I think, are more involved. I think the Jordanians really do want to see a resolution to Gaza. They want to see a resolution to what's happening in the West Bank with the expansion of settlements. The Jordanians don't like the rhetoric that's coming out of Israel, which is that Jordan is Palestine. That's, right wing was Israelis will sometimes say that Jordan is Palestine. The Jordanians really don't want to to listen to hear that, and Jordan also views itself as a sort of caretaker of Jerusalem, and that any ultimate compromise made between the Palestinians and the Israelis also needs to have Jordan's approval. So the Jordanians are a little bit more involved. The Qataris are certainly involved when it comes to Gaza, but ultimately to resolve this, the Trump administration is going to have to rein in Netanyahu, and also not just Netanyahu, but Israeli society writ large. Because sometimes we use Netanyahu as a shorthand for everything that Israel is doing in Gaza, or even the West Bank. But we have to remember that Israeli society has been radicalized since October 7th. And even though many Israelis don't like Netanyahu, they don't like him for domestic political reasons. It's not necessarily that they don't like what he's doing in Gaza. And so I think the US is going to have to, and the Trump administration is well placed to do this, is going to have to remind Israeli society just how reliant it is on US military weapons transfers and support and technology, and that this is not an equal relationship, and they should disabuse themselves of any fantasy that it's an equal relationship.
The so I guess the larger question here is, what would a policy of diplomacy and restraint coming from the Trump administration look like? I mean, if you were Trump's national security advisor or Secretary of State, what would what would what would the framework be, the diplomatic framework be that you would want to put together there?
I would be immediately exploring backdoor channels of communications with the Iranians and try to restart the talks. I would let the Israelis know that if they try to sabotage the talks again, they're going to get no U.S. support, and in fact, U.S. support will be rescinded for other things they want to do. I would put pressure on the Netanyahu government to seriously engage a ceasefire with the Palestinians in Gaza, and to and to abandon this fantasy that they're going to be able to kill every last Hamas militant, or that they're going to be able to transfer the Palestinians out of Gaza. I would create some red lines when it comes to settlements in the West Bank. I would probably follow a little bit of a similar playbook in Syria, except I might not have I might not have given 100% sanctions relief until I saw that the government was going to behave responsibly. But, I think on balance, the sanctions relief was positive. I would be withdrawing U.S. troops from the Kurdish areas in northeast Syria and letting the Syrian Democratic Forces, which are our Kurdish partners in Syria, letting them know they have to come to some understanding with the government in Damascus because we're not going to be there forever. I would continue to withdraw U.S. troops from Iraq, but I wouldn't do it precipitously. I would do it, gradually. So some of these things he is doing, but basically, I wouldn't. What I would do differently is I wouldn't assume that I can compartmentalize the Middle East. Make progress in one area while letting another area completely fester. Because what happens is that the area you let fester and ends up sabotaging and undermining the other area where you're making progress.
The which kind of brings us back to the American public. I mean, we fought the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and withdrew from Afghanistan, and that was a painful experience. And there's certainly a public sentiment in the U.S. that the U.S. should not be engaged in these forever wars in the Middle East. But I wonder if under the Biden presidency, we didn't see kind of a neglect or failure to prioritize a wider strategy for the region that could be successful.
Yeah, the Biden administration was completely skittish. I mean, he was part of the Obama administration that negotiated the Iran nuclear agreement. On day one of his presidency, he should have reinstated the JCPOA via executive order, and the Republicans would have complained. And so what? They would have forgotten about it. I mean, one thing the Trump administration knows, well, they might not have forgotten about it, but the news cycle would have moved on. But one thing the Trump administration knows is the power of the news cycle. It can do something and people can complain about it, and 48 hours happens and there's something else to talk about. The Biden administration was completely scared of the news cycle, completely scared of criticism, and I think they also had this maximalist approach, and they got in the office and they thought, okay, well, we have this JCPOA that the Obama administration, one that I was part of, and many of his many folks in his administration were also part of the Obama administration. We could just reinstate it, but what if we can get a little bit more, and they had this maximalist kind of greedy attitude when they should have just re-entered the JCPOA and then moved on from there. But they weren't willing to do I mean, I wouldn't even call it a risky thing. They weren't willing to do moderately risky things like that. They were very, very, very risk averse, and it blew up in their face. I mean, you have Jake Sullivan writing in Foreign Affairs that the Middle East is quieter than it's ever been. We're just going to move on, and then the October 7th attacks happen. I think one thing we've learned since October 7th in the last couple of years is that people's predictions are useless. I mean, I don't know if you're going to ask me for a prediction at some point during this interview, but I'll tell the listeners right now that whatever I say is completely useless. You should reject it. People, professionals in the intelligence community, academics, almost all their predictions are wrong. I know people will twist what they said or wrote in the past to say, well, actually, it was really right. If you read between the lines of what I said, it was right, even though I said the exact opposite of what happened. But I know virtually nobody who has predicted any of this correctly, or once in a while they predict one thing that happens to, so predictions are quite useless. But what you can look at is trends. And the trend of the Biden administration is that it was risk averse and it wasn't willing to do big things diplomatically. And it was just in a sort of reactive mode. Um, and then
Yeah,
the
I mean,
Trump administration was the opposite.
it was kind of tragic to watch it unfold. I mean, especially for me. I mean, I covered Biden in the U.S. Senate back in the aughts after 9/11, when he was chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and played a really vital role coordinating U.S. policy with the Bush administration in the region. And I think that experience was very formative for him. Biden, to me, seemed to be very sensitive to the sectarian divisions in Iraq between Sunni and Shia, and elsewhere in the Middle East between different ethnic groups. And I wonder if that didn't play a role in what I view as his failure to apply greater pressure on the Israelis for restraint after October 7th. I mean, when those attacks happened, he actually came out and warned the Israelis, don't make the same mistakes we made after 9/11. And 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 so here we have a president who, in retrospect and observationally, even at the time, was getting on in years and was a bit dotery. I mean, with all respect, and I do respect him, um, it appeared that Sullivan and Secretary of State Antony Blinken were driving policy, and they gave the Israelis and probably with Biden's agreement a lot of room to run.
Yeah. And, I think one thing we have to remember right after October 7th, it was hard to tell the Israelis, hey, you really got to be calm. You got to react in a very calm way. A lot of people were calling for a ceasefire like within 48 hours after October 7th. And I think that was delusional. There's no country in the world that wouldn't have a reaction to October 7th. And I think it broke the psyche of Israelis, the same way 9/11 broke the psyche of Americans. Now, people dispute whether this is true or not, but let's just say perception is reality. I mean, the Israelis believe that October 7th had a sexual component. Now, imagine if 9/11 also had a sexual component, what that would do to the psychology of Americans. So it broke Israeli society, and it was hard in the initial days to call for restraint. But there came a period very early on in the conflict, within a couple months, when it was clear that the Israelis were not behaving in a rational or strategic way. And it was on the Biden administration to rein them in. Could they have reined them in? Maybe, maybe not. The Israelis might view the destruction of Gaza as such a vital interest that they're going to go ahead with it anyway. But the Biden administration didn't use the tools that it did have, and worse, it enabled it. So there is some blood on their hands. I also think that Biden was a true in Israel, and was also worried about the domestic ramifications politically of being too hard on the Israelis, and I think they genuinely believed that. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
One thing
I
I
mean,
always say is that we shouldn't be enabling. There's different versions of it in Israel, and unfortunately, we're enabling the worst version of Israel.
you mentioned that I think you described it as a fantasy. This idea that the Israelis are going to remove the Palestinians from Gaza. I mean, we can all see that they've reduced Gaza to a moonscape. It's hard to envision how it's ever going to become habitable without without Israeli direction or Israeli control. Uh, they're talking about a humanitarian city where they're going to herd 2 million Palestinians together. I don't really understand how that's going to work, and maybe you don't either. But what I mean, and we, we have ample evidence of war crimes. The International Criminal Court has indicted Netanyahu, and there's there is a real problem here. What would be the expected? How do you expect the Trump administration to try to fix this? Are we looking at? I mean, you've recommended that they advise the Israelis against this plan, but it seems to me that Trump is not going to do that. That in fact he's going to support it.
Well, it's neither humanitarian nor is it a city. Some people refer to it as a concentration camp. I mean, we can we we can go back and forth whether that language applies or not. But at its most basic definition, they are concentrating a bunch of Palestinians into one place, and I'm sure it's going to be an absolute disaster. And they're doing it not with the intention of rebuilding Gaza necessarily, but I think with the intention of continuing their whack-a-mole campaign against Hamas and making Gaza even more uninhabitable. I don't think the Israelis can be the leaders of the reconstruction of Gaza. I think what would have to happen is that there'd have to be a third party, probably a Gulf state, that comes in and rebuilds it. It's in. I don't pretend to have the answers, but I know that the current approach to Gaza is not the solution.
Yeah, I don't pretend to have the answers either, but I am very worried about the future and what it holds. I don't want to let you off the hook, Adam, without talking about Pakistan, which is a nuclear power, and its role in the Middle East and its relationship with the United States. How do they view all of this in Islamabad?
What's going on in the Middle East?
Yeah,
Well, I think they're viewing it with a 10-foot pole. They don't really want to be too involved in it. I mean, there's protests in support of the Palestinians that happen in Islamabad, but they're kept in check by the state, and the state makes sure that they don't, surround the U.S. embassy or anything like that. So, Pakistan has bigger problems right now. Pakistan's essentially in a war with the Pakistani Taliban, or the TTP, Tariq-i-Taliban Pakistan, and that war is causing Pakistani military casualties that are basically at the same level that the U.S. was experiencing during the surge in Afghanistan. So they have that going on, and they had their flare up along the line of control with India, which led to military strikes inside Rawalpindi. So that would be like a military strike happening in Arlington. So they have bigger problems to deal with. They're observing what's happening in the Middle East, and I think ultimately the way Pakistan tends to view things is they'll follow a little, they'll lag behind a little bit what direction the Gulf and the Saudis are going. And so you saw some statements by Pakistani officials where they sort of were very ambiguous about what would happen if the Saudis normalized with Israel. Maybe they would, maybe they wouldn't. They'll go with the region, and they'll always say that they'll support whatever the Palestinians decide. I think it's an issue that matters to ordinary Pakistanis to some degree, but the Pakistani state has bigger problems to deal with right now.
well, Adam, thank you for all of that. Any final thoughts for our listeners, or questions I should have asked but didn't?
I mean, there's so we would need like 5 hours to really go through the Middle East, and I'm frankly not expert enough. I mean, I don't consider myself an expert in anything really, so I don't know if I'd be qualified to go through all of those questions. But I guess what I would say to listeners is, if be really careful about what you're reading with the sort of the columnists and the New York Times and the Washington Post, and what you might be hearing on NPR and CNN, because it really is an echo chamber in which a certain narrative gets repeated and reflected back, and of those voices aren't really based on any kind of firsthand knowledge on the ground. So I would recommend reading news sources from folks who really do spend a lot of time on the ground. All Monitor is a great source for that because they do investigative reporting on the ground. Amwaj is another good source for things going on in the Middle East. Or if you're going to watch big media, make sure that it's balanced. Maybe you watch CNN one day and Al Jazeera another day. You're going to get two very different perspectives, and maybe the truth is somewhere in the middle. So that's what I'd say, because it's funny when I talk to people who don't think about these things every day. You can really, just by speaking with them for 1 or 2 minutes, you can immediately know what media they're consuming, because they're reflecting it right back to you. And I'd say that a lot of it is just talking points, and they're finding interviews that confirm those talking points, but it's not real investigative journalism. There's just not that much real investigative journalism left, and I'd say they should try to seek that out.
Hmm. Are you going to be traveling to the region anytime soon to do your own work there?
Yeah, I am traveling to Beirut in about 5 days now, which I haven't been to, and I was last in Beirut maybe at this point literally a decade ago, which is going to be interesting because a decade ago was in the middle of the Syrian civil war. Hezbollah was quite strong. They had achieved some significant victories against the the Syrian revolution, because at that time Hezbollah was backing the Assad regime, of course. And now I'll be traveling to a Beirut where there's significant action being taken against Hezbollah by the Lebanese state. In fact, just today, I think the Central Bank of Lebanon announced that certain transactions with Hezbollah related entities are going to be blocked. I didn't read the report, so I don't quote me on those details, but it was something like that. And so you see this shift happening in Lebanon. So it's going to be really interesting to see firsthand what it's like. And I might be going some other places in the region, and we can talk when I come back.
No, definitely. Yeah, I'd love to have you back and hear your hear your thoughts and assessment. Adam, thank you so much for that. That was brilliant.
Okay, appreciate it so much.
All right, take care. Safe
Oh, okay.
travels.
Thank you. Thank you.